Chapter 13, the final section, Politics in the State in the Renaissance, the New Monarchs. The developments in this last section are mainly political, and they're happening simultaneous to the Italian and Northern Renaissances, but they're not really related to them. They're kind of separate issues, but the author of our book chooses to include them here because they're happening at the same time. They're also happening in different places in Europe. The Italian Renaissance is obviously in Italy. The Northern Renaissance was up near Flanders and Bruges and modern-day Belgium. These developments politically are in England, France, and Spain, which actually are the only three countries that are really nations at the time. Everything else is sort of city-states and territories. These three nations are becoming nations. In fact, that's one of the whole points of the new monarchs. They're called new because they're very modern and they're centralizing their authority. Let's go through these characteristics right off the bat because they're all very important. In each of these three countries, the monarchs are making an effort to reduce violence. That sounds very familiar to the modern world, to even today. We have such a huge amount of violence across our country, even just this last few months and years. Establishing law and order, stability, curbing the influence of probably the most dangerous group to you as a king, who were the nobles. You got to get rid of these nobles one way or another. They're your biggest threat. Guys running around with weapons from the late Middle Ages, those are the nobles. We got to keep them down. Consolidate or centralize power away from local people, away from nobles, and toward yourself as the king. In all three countries, the monarchs had a strong sense of royal authority. They believed it was good to be king. They liked being king. They embraced the position, and they wanted to project that power and that majesty. They got to control the church. You getting a sense of this? They got to control all the different competing groups in society. They have to be on top. So now we have to take power away from the church. Particularly, the Pope is going to be the rival in some of these examples. These kings acted Machiavellian. They didn't know him. They didn't read his book. It wasn't even published in some ways yet. But they behaved that way. They believed it was better to be feared and be secure than be loved. So they were behaving that way even though they didn't know him. And then one thing that's changing now is that instead of the church and the nobility, the monarchs of the new monarchies are going to make deals and secure relationships with the middle class, who are business owners. Middle class people, business owners. They're wealthy. They don't have a title. They're not in the military. They're just rich people in your society, and you got to get them on your side because rich people are going to pay taxes. And taxes are important for kingdoms and kings. And lastly, there's a sense of nationalism, a rising sense of we are Spanish, we are English, we are French. No more, we're not local as much anymore. We're not based on cities. We're going to be national, have a national identity like we do as Americans. To sum up for you, the new monarchs are about having one set of laws, one king, and one religion that the king controls. Those are the 3 points. One law, one king, one faith, if you had to sort of sum it up. Let's get into the first example, the French. The French new monarch, the first guy that's going to act like this is Charles VII. Charles VII. And he is king during the 100 Years' War. In fact, he's the king that is basically crowned right after Joan of Arc won the beat back the siege of Orleans. Just to go back to chapter 12 a little bit, this is the guy that is crowned right after the French start winning ground again. And so he's going to try to end the 100 Years' War, which he did, and win it. As you see here, age of recovery, ending the 100 Years' War, the Civil War in France and with England. And he's going to then take authority and centralize it. First thing he does, he's got to reorganize what's called the Royal Council. The Royal Council are your advisors, the people that make policy with you as the king, your closest friends and advisors, kind of like the president's cabinet today. That used to be the nobility in France. And this is the first guy to swap them out. We're going to get rid of the nobility on the Royal Council, and we're going to put in middle-class people who we trust. A lot of those nobles had actually fought against the king of France in the 100 Years' War because they took the side of the English Remember there was that civil war, but some of the guys were supporting England for economic and political reasons, so he doesn't trust those nobles anymore. We got to get rid of them, and we put the middle class people instead. You're going to make money. We got to strengthen the economy of France. We need new taxes. The gabelle is a tax on salt, and everyone loves salt, so you got to pay an extra tax to have it. You need salt not only for flavoring, but to preserve food so it doesn't spoil, because there's no refrigerators yet. The tile is a tax on land or property. That sounds familiar. We have that in America. We pay property taxes. So these are two new sources of revenue for the French kingdom. He's going to change up the army, and he's going to pay them by his own treasury. The king is going to pay the army by the state now, not the nobles. The armies of France used to be loyal to the nobles, and the nobles were the chief soldiers going back to the Middle Ages, and now the king is going to be the main source of the army, and he's going to have a permanent army, a standing army. Put that word in your notes. Standing army means it doesn't go away, it's permanent. The church, we got to get control of the church in France. So the French king makes a deal with the Pope. This guy makes a deal with the Pope at the time, and he basically says, I want the right to appoint all church officials like bishops, priests. The Pope used to appoint all those people and then send them off into the different countries. The French king wants to appoint all the church officials in France, and he gets that right from the Pope. It's called Gallican rights, French rights. The French kings run the French church, and there's money involved. The French kings agree to pay certain taxes to the Pope, and it's a bit of a bribery kind of thing, but that's okay. They get the right to control the French church from within. That's what Gallican means, French. It's a religious term. The next of the new monarchs in France, in fact, this guy's son is Louis XI, so we got 711. Remember 711, that's how you can remember the two new monarchs. This guy's known as the Spider King because he was devious and Machiavellian, and he said money is the answer to all of our problems. So we've got to expand our finances even more. We're going to bring in new industries like silk and weaving and things that were really dominant like in Flanders and other parts of Europe. We got to do those things here in France and make a profit at them. We're going to continue to expand the army, continue to expand business and trade, and he was very open to bringing in foreign craftsmen from other parts of Europe who were experts at their trade to come and live and work in France. This is going to bring in lots of money and revenue. He's going to acquire and sort of finish off the 100 Years' War, getting back areas that had not been loyal. So we're going to reclaim Burgundy, bring back the territory of Brittany. These are just some examples. So he expands the French state physically, territorially, and is now aiming toward one unified country. So the end result here, so just to sum up on the religious issue, who's controlling religion in France? They continue to chip away at the Pope's authority. The French king controls religion in France. Okay, and he's getting the right to appoint all the different church officials in France by paying the Pope, giving him tax money. That was just a sort of a repeat point there. All right, the next country is England. This is the Tudor dynasty is what we're talking about now. England is also coming out of the 100 Years' War, which they lose. The Black Plague had hit the English people quite heavily as well. There was a lot of population loss, a lot of loss through the war. There was a civil war in England called the War of the Roses at the end of the 100 Years' War, where two different families were duking it out in terms of who's going to take over the throne of England. This is the houses of York and Lancaster. These are their symbols were different colored roses, and that's why it's called the War of the Roses. Kind of confusing. But what happens is a third family comes into this civil war and knocks them both out, and it's the Tudors. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about the Tudors in the next several weeks. There's only a couple generations of the Tudors. They start here with Henry VII. They go to Henry VIII, the famous giant English king. And then his kids, who's the most famous is Queen Elizabeth I. That's it. Those are the three generations of the Tudors. They love their authority. They're going to strengthen England. They're going to avoid all these wars. Wars are expensive. So they're going to use diplomacy to negotiate treaties with their enemies instead of fighting wars. They learned their lesson from the 100 Years' War. And if we don't have to fight war, then we don't have to rely on that parliament composed of all the nobles in England. We don't need them for money anymore. So remember, that was the 100 Years' War. The English Parliament became supreme because the king needed so much money. If we can get rid of the need for war, we don't need to call the Parliament into session that much. And now we've taken away some power from our nobility. Same thing, the Royal Council as in France. The Royal Council has a lot of authority. It's 12 to 15 men. They make policy with the king. We've got to get rid of the nobles, and we've got to replace them with new middle-class members. This is what it's all about. Decreasing nobles, rising middle class. Same as in France. And what are we going to do with those nobles now that used to be a member of our royal council? We're going to investigate them and put them on trial. This is called the Court of the Star Chamber, STAR. It's a special tribunal. It's like a court system that targeted nobles that were thought to be untrustworthy or treasonous. They used torture. They convicted without evidence. There were no juries. They made people confess to things they didn't do. And it was named after the room in the Palace of Justice in London. That it was a special room where the trials took place, and it had stars on the ceiling. And so this term now, the Court of the Star Chamber, has a modern connotation. It sort of means any time that there's like an illegal trial being held or people are being accused without evidence, they call it like a modern day Star Chamber. This is how the English are getting rid of their nobles. Everyone's doing it. Justices of the peace are enacted. These are local law enforcement officials that are now loyal to the king. These are like the local cops, the police. We call them JPs, Justices of the Peace. And we're trying to get rid of the influence of nobles. Nobles had been kind of like the army and the police force before, and now we want a new force of people that are paid by the king, loyal to the king. That's called Justices of the Peace. Henry VI, to sum up, and his successors won the support of the middle class in England by promoting their interest in political stability, business, making money, being safe. Those people gave the king tax money, and in return he gave them protection. And the nobles are cut out of the deal. Let's go into our third story. The Spanish, probably the most important of the three and the most interesting. The Spanish, what are they coming out of here? Their long history in Spain. There wasn't anything in common among Spanish people until this particular era. There were lots of different little kingdoms that were independent. They all had different cultures, different languages, different religions. There had been a strong Islamic presence in Spain that we're going to talk about. In fact, one of the things going on in Spain for the previous several hundred years is known as the Reconquista, which is the effort on the part of the Spanish people to expel Muslims and Jews from Spain. And this was a hundreds of years in the making, centuries of warfare. So there was not a lot going on in Spain except for war. And now here, when Ferdinand and Isabella come on the scene, they're going to unify the kingdom and kick out their enemies and be really good examples of new monarchs. One law, one king or queen, one faith. So Ferdinand and Isabella, these are famous, the new monarchs of Spain. They're husband and wife. They each came from different parts of Spain. One of them came from Aragon. One of them came from Castile. And when they got married, they joined the two territories. And you have sort of like a dynastic union between these two territories of Spain. They're the two biggest provinces. Ferdinand was from Aragon and Isabella was from Castile. They're not a unified nation yet, but they're on the way. So what are the key themes of these guys' reign? They're going to centralize the church, one religion, national pride, get rid of our enemies, one law, all minority groups have to go. Sounds familiar with all three stories. Their first act was to institute what are called the Hermandades, brotherhoods. Just like the Justices of the Peace in England, these are the local police force now in every little city in Spain, and they're paid by the king, so they're loyal to the king. They're going to do the same thing with their royal council. They're going to put the middle class in power, and they're going to take away the nobility. Same story. Middle class in, nobles out. They're going to control their church. They got to make a deal. They got a pope at stake here. His name is Pope Alexander VI. This is that Borgia pope from the Renaissance. who had that son, Cesare Borgia, who Machiavelli liked so much. This is sort of like the evil Borgias. They know this guy can make a deal. He's willing to take money from them. So he's not the most holy spiritual pope out there. So the Spanish king and queen secure, just like the French king, the right to appoint all the church officials in Spain. And they promise the pope that they will take the title the Catholic kings of Spain. The pope gives them this title. It makes the pope look good because it looks like he's controlling Spain, although he's not. And in return, Ferdinand and Isabella get to control the entire Spanish church away from Rome and the pope. So now we have a national, top-down Catholic church in Spain. This is one of the most distinguishing features of Spanish identity then and even still today. And it starts with Ferdinand and Isabella. And they're going to get rid of all the minority religious groups at this point, starting with the Muslims. The Reconquista is completed in January of 1492. Here's Ferdinand, by the way. He doesn't look so good in this picture. Here's Isabella, the queen, beautiful girl, young and beautiful. He was not so beautiful. And then I guess she wasn't when she got old. This is when she's young. This is when she's old. She looked better when she was young. Here it is, the map. Look at this map now. This is the joining of Castile and Aragon, 1469. That refers to the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. Granada is where the last bit of Spain that Muslims controlled. And they're going to be kicked out in 1492. There was a long history of Islamic rule throughout Spain and the southern parts, even up almost into northern Spain, and that's been whittled away over the centuries, and to the point that all that was left was Granada. And there's war here. There's military conquest between Spanish and Muslims, and the Spanish win. In 1492, they complete this. Here's a picture of it. Of the Spanish king on the right. There's Ferdinand saying goodbye to the Islamic ruler on the left as they leave Granada and are expelled from Spain for the last time. The Spanish king and queen took over then the former Muslim palace called the Alhambra, which is one of this amazing work of Islamic architecture from around 1000 roughly AD, so it's a wonderful example of architecture in Spain, and now this becomes one of the royal palaces of the king and queen of Spain. It's this beautiful Eastern architecture with lots of arches and pools and palm trees. Anyway, this is now one of the most famous tourist attractions in Spain, owned by the Spanish government, and it's from this palace actually that Ferdinand and Isabella are going to send out Columbus to explore the New World. We'll get to that in a minute. All right, the second minority group in Spain that's going to go are the Jews. So we've gotten rid of the Muslims, and here come the Jews. Now, the Jews had a long history in Spain, centuries. They had lived in Spain, and they'd had really good jobs. They had a lot of money. They had a lot of more lawyers and doctors, and in finance. So the traditional Jewish population had been accepted in Spain for a long, long time. And then, starting in the 14th century, the 1300s, really remember that's when the Black Plague was hitting, there was a change. There was a wave of persecution against Jews in Spain. And we have what are called pogroms. A pogrom is an organized violence against a minority group, and that term usually refers to organized violence against Jews. At one point, right after the Black Plague, there was something like 40% of the Jews in Spain were either killed or had to convert forcibly to Christianity. They became scapegoats like they were all over Europe. The ones that converted instead of being killed, the ones that they said either basically convert to Christianity, Catholicism, or be killed, the Jews that converted were called conversos, converted. And we also call them the new Christians. Those are the two names that get used, conversos or new Christians. And now these guys, they stayed pretty important. Their jobs were still really good. They still were doctors. They still had high positions in government. They were tax collectors. 1/3 of the royal council in Spain was made up of former Jews that were now converted Christians, called conversos. Even Catholic church officials were part of this, came from the new Christian group, law and medicine. So really good. Now let me give you the numbers. There were 200,000 of these new Christians, former Jews, lineage-wise, in a population of about 7 million in Spain. So a pretty small fraction, but they had a lot of the best jobs. This is why the Spanish are going to hate them. And even though they converted, that's not good enough. They're going to launch the Spanish Inquisition. Famous moment in history. The Spanish Inquisition is targeting, it's a political tool to get rid of minority groups in the nation. We've already gotten rid of the Muslims, and now it's the Spanish turn. So the targets of the Spanish Inquisition are the converted Jews, the conversos. Those are the targets. They didn't believe that they had converted. They didn't believe they were true Christians. But it was really all about who had power and influence and money. The word inquisition is a word for a trial or a tribunal or a court system. We're going to see that word several times. This is run by the Catholic Church in Spain. The government, the king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, turn this over to the Catholic Church and say, get rid of all these conversos. We don't believe that they are who they say they are. So that's the Inquisition. Starts in 1478. One of the things the Inquisition does is they start to use all these racial theories. They say if you were ever Jewish, that your bloodline is forever Jewish. If you're, they're very crude, very crass, primitive, very limited understanding of genetics or whatever. They just thought if you were ever Jewish, you could never not be Jewish again because you have Jewish blood in you. Even though these people were Christians now, and they said they were Christians, they simply weren't believed. And so they use these kind of creepy racial theories to try to justify their behavior in the Inquisition. So what's the result? Ultimately, the Spanish Inquisition is a decree from Ferdinand and Isabella called the Alhambra Decree, made at that palace, where they formally expelled the remaining new Christians, the conversos, from Spain. And 150,000 had to leave. That's what was left by the time we hit 1492. A few doctors stayed to help treat, that were new Christians, to help treat the Spanish king and queen, which is ironic, but most had to go. Other parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, wherever they could be accepted. So 1492 is a critical turning point year in Spain. It's the end of the Reconquista, which is culminating in the conquest of Granada and the expulsion of the Muslims from Spain. So that's the first group that's out. The second thing that happens, also in 1492, is the expulsion of the Jews through the Alhambra Decree. The third thing that happens is that to celebrate all of this, all of the conquering of our enemies and our one law, one king, one faith, Columbus is commissioned to explore and sail the ocean blue on behalf of Spain and go start the New World exploration. So this is now the beginning of what we call the Golden Age of Spain. The Golden Age. It lasts from 1492 all the way to about 1600. And Spain is going to be the most significant power in the world for 100 years. They're going to be the richest country in Europe. They're going to conquer most of North America, including where we sit right here in Arizona. And they're going to be rich and powerful, and their kings are going to try to make the whole world Spanish and Catholic. And we're going to get to that in a couple of chapters. That's it, chapter 13 in the books.